Welcome to SciTech Culture with Steve Kern and Ben Warner, where we examine science, technology and culture in the 21st century. Visit our website at scitechculture.com. Hello and welcome to SciTech Culture. My name is Ben Warner and I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague Steve Kern. How are we, Steve? You got a little bit of a taste of the lockdown life in the last couple of days over in Adelaide.
Yes, we did, Ben. Thank you very much. We're all well here. We're all happy, and we're all about to dial out for pizza.
Well, just touching on that, for anyone that doesn't know, Adelaide it's had a bit of and South Australia have had a bit of a COVID scare with a cluster developing out of nowhere, and I guess it would have been more acute because South Australia hadn't had any cases for such a long time, and I think it kind of freaked everyone out when it happened, and I guess there was a very strong intervention made by the government based on some information, and we'll get to that story in a minute, which triggered at the time, a 6-day hard lockdown. But what I think is interesting about this whole story was just the way it developed in the subsequent days later. And I'll let you speak to it a bit more since you were living it, obviously. But watching it from afar over in Victoria, which went through its own lockdown, albeit a bit different one, I saw the press conference with the Premier, and all I caught straight up as soon as I flicked the TV on was, I'm absolutely fuming at this guy that provided false information to the contact tracers, and then it just went off from there. And I thought, wow, this is a bit different, and maybe it plays well for TV. I don't know.
Well, I think he probably regrets going off a bit like that now. I think, by comparison, the chief medical officer and the police commissioner were far more measured. Look, probably wasn't the right thing to do to lie, but I don't think in telling an untruth, that person really understood the consequences. And perhaps it could be argued that if the result of his lie was of such consequence, they might have done a little bit of checking up first before they called the lockdown. Having said that, though, it goes to show that, in South Australia at least, we're prepared enough to go in to slow the spread of any cluster or infection, very seriously, very quickly.
Yeah.
And, to be fair to all involved, as soon as they realised that what they thought was happening wasn't, everyone's allowed to go back out and exercise. So happy days here.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on from COVID. We've covered that so often this year. I'm sure we'll cover it again when something else happens, as it does. But we're going to return to some tech topics, following on from our last week's episode with the Apple's M1 chip, and obviously some of these machines are now out in the wild. We've got reviewers testing them. Still early days, I think, because it's only 1 week's worth of testing, etc. But there are some truly extraordinary results and benchmarks coming out from the use of this chip. Basically, side-by-side comparisons with literally the same computer that has an Intel chip, with the M1 pretty much smoking the Intel chip in just about every instance. And it wasn't just that it was smoking it from a performance perspective. There was also the battery life sort of comparison as well. So the key thing that I noticed on one test that one of these reviewers did was they did a whole bunch of rendering out of Final Cut, and like on the Intel version, from battery life perspective, they pretty much had killed the battery, whereas the M1 chip computer had only gone down 30-40% for the same task. Or set of tasks that they had done. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, we covered this a lot last week, but it just kind of reinforces the fact that they're really onto something in terms of driving the Mac platform forward, and it truly is an exciting development in terms of what is now potentially possible with these computers.
Oh, look, we spoke about it last week, but when you can integrate your operating system with the hardware, you're always going to come out ahead. They're purpose building these chips for the way Apple's operate. the OS, but also the apps that sit on there. So this is fantastic. Look, I thought from my point of view, the most telling thing was we can talk about the performance all day, but it's quite obviously there and it is impressive. And it's because now, for the first time, Apple's not just like the others. It hasn't got an Intel chip. It's got something different, and what it's got works far better in their machines than an Intel chip ever could. But the most telling thing I thought in the reviews were, one, that neither the MacBook Pro nor the Air had been redesigned, so they still look the same. And then the second thing, these are the cons, by the way, not the pros. And then the other one was the lack of ports. On the Air, I completely get only having 2 ports. I do have to say on the Pro, and we've spoken about this before, give us a few more ports. Honestly, Pro means that I should be able to plug it into anything that my friend from wherever they come from arrives with, and I don't need dongles. I don't know if you've got anything to say about that, but that's what Pro is.
Yeah, the only thing, to be a little bit fair, although it goes to the confusion in the lineup, I think, is that the Pro is there's actually 2 lines of Pro. It's not one, and the one that they upgraded with the M1 chip is what would be considered the base level Pro, which is the one that always had 2 ports, whereas they've still got the 4 USB-C port MacBook Pro in the lineup, but it's still got the Intel chips in it. Presumably at some stage they'll upgrade those with the M2 or whatever eventually ends up coming out. But funny enough, you mentioned about that they didn't change the hardware, etc., and that was actually something I hadn't thought of last week, or when this whole sort of thing started to kick into gear, was that I was looking at this thinking, yeah, I'd be perfectly happy with one of them, but I'm actually thinking to myself, if I was in the zone to potentially purchase one, I think I might sit these first ones out. And what my thinking around that was that maybe these are just, okay, we've got the existing designs, we're going to show you how good this chip is by just swapping the chip out, but still using the same, sort of basic hardware design. And you'll go, wow, that's fantastic. The thing for me is that what the next version of this is, they are going to redesign the actual hardware itself.
You're killing me, Ben. You're thinking like the CEO of Apple. I love it.
And it's actually that one, I think, that is the one that's going to be good to get. So, for instance, there's been rumours for a long time around redesigning the current 13-inch so that 13-inch laptops, so that it's basically the same physical footprint, but they squeeze a 14-inch screen into it. Yeah. So what I'm gonna crystal ball this. If the next one that comes out is like what I just said, redesigned, it's 13-inch body, maybe even 12 and a half, but they somehow miraculously fit a 14-inch screen into it, and they put a touch screen on it, they improve the webcams, they do all the things that people are criticizing these current ones about with the next generation with the M2 in it. That's the one that you probably should hold out for.
Sorry, Apple. Ben has just convinced me to delay my purchase.
But having said that, if like in your case, if you hadn't had a recent recent MacBook purchase, these are absolutely great to purchase. But my recommendation to you would just get the base MacBook Air. Don't even spend a cent more, because I don't really see the value.
I think you are spot on, because going through those reviews, wherever they mentioned the cons, it was always around the bezel, around the edge is still like fairly thick on those Airbooks, and also the fact, the cameras, et cetera, et cetera. So it will be interesting to see. I think the other really interesting point you bring up is that there's the 2 lines of MacBook Pro, and so even with the extra ports, I don't know why you would get an Intel chip MacBook now at all, but it is an interesting, I guess, question for me. 4 USB ports is not what I'm after. For work, I use a X360 HP, and basically that's got, that many ports, and it's not a whole lot thicker. Now, I know, Apple doesn't think like that, but it's really useful to have USB-A, USB-C, to have, a whole variety of ports, like so that if somebody drops in with a hard drive, you can plug it in. You don't have to go to the shop first to buy another converter or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. But I think Apple's gone too far down that path now. If anything, they're going to reduce even further the amount of ports that are on there rather than adding more.
Well, that's not a bad thing. And look, Steve Jobs started this by getting rid of the floppy drive. And at the time, everyone sort of gasped. But as he bloody showed at the time, it was the floppy drive was actually already done. There was no, so no one missed it. I kind of just think that it might be a little bit early to be going no port.
Well, we may get that with the iPhone next year. Who knows? I mean, that whole MagSafe charging thing to me was a huge red flag to say, get ready, guys. We're about to get rid of the port.
But for phones, I think that's a good idea. There's no need for a port in phones, especially if you're only going to give people earbuds.
And I guess if you get rid of that port, you can, drop it to 12 meters underwater and it'll be fine as they rate.
Exactly, and you probably then can have a complete screen and no bezel, and probably a screen on the back as well. Who knows?
Absolutely. All right. Well, while we're still talking about chips, let's head over to Microsoft, and because there was a new story that had come out about a new processor that they're developing called the Pluton. I believe, lovely marketing name, and apparently it's sort of like the next generation security chip that already created what was called a trusted platform module that's been part of PCs for a long time, but Microsoft was wanting to update it just in terms of the recent sort of exploits like Spectre and Meltdown, and to put a chip in that would enhance security for Windows PCs. And they actually brokered a deal with Intel, AMD, and Qualcomm to basically integrate this Pluton chip directly into their chip. So there's no because at the moment as I understand, the TPM chip that's used is separate. So that means it's exploitable by some clever hackers if they want to. So for all the talk that we've just said about Apple's approach, like we're doing the whole stack kind of approach. We don't necessarily partner with people and all that sort of thing. I find it interesting that Microsoft is sort of like their core tenet is partnering, and they managed to get 3 chip makers to basically adopt their approach to this particular issue.
Well, yeah, look, I think this is the sad story of, sort of the slick Apple versus the, sort of poor cousin Microsoft. I mean, from what I understand, Apple's M1 chip has got exactly the same sort of security feature embedded in there. So Apple's done it all in one. There's got a great, chip that works only for their devices and makes their devices head and shoulders above the rest. Microsoft, not knowing what to do, has come up with the same idea about the security feature, and let's be obvious here, probably the NSA has told Apple and Microsoft that they have to do it or something like that, And I think, probably the reality is that if the 3 partners, Intel, AMD, and who's the other one?
And Qualcomm.
And Qualcomm, if they want to be able to run Office on their chips, they're probably going to need to include it. So, look, I think it's a great idea, and I think it's really good to see someone like Microsoft taking the initiative, and it'll embed security into the Office 365 environment and really into the Windows operating system too, I would suspect. So it's by no means a bad idea, and there's nothing negative really to say about it, but it doesn't really achieve anything marvellous like Apple have managed to do across the road, So the whole package that Apple's got, everyone's going, wow, that's amazing. And I guess we kind of should expect that there's good security on every chip that we use. It's just,
Well, okay. Well, maybe like in wrapping up this particular conversation and pulling these two stories together, the M1, the Pluton, etc. There's an active discussion, I think, about who could actually replicate what Apple's doing right now, and the answer may be nobody. Not unless a completely new company or say someone like Microsoft decides to invest in building a system where they build the whole stack themselves. The Surface doesn't really apply in this instance, because although they're building the hardware, they're still using Intel chips, etc. And it would seem that if you look at the alternatives, they'd almost have to, like a couple of them would have to come together, like as a group, to replicate what Apple's doing. And that's only because of the nature of the way they chose to pursue the strategy to begin with. So, way back when, Apple was always about, we're doing the whole thing, and now 40 years later, it's really going to pay off. But the sort of partnering sort of get everyone to do everything approach that I guess Microsoft took, which, because Microsoft was more or less a software company as opposed to a hardware company, it leads to some serious issues with the ability for an alternative. Because I actually think that as wonderful as, all these Apple, advancements have been, like with the M1 chip, etc., I would still like to see a genuine alternative, because I just don't think just having one version of something is necessarily healthy, because you can get, because different companies have different ideas, they can come up and as sort of like bouncing off each other, they can push the whole thing forward. But it seems like at least at the moment, it's starting to look very lopsided.
Well, this is really just back to where it was before Apple started using Intel chips, honestly. Like, back then there was Apple and then there was everyone else. I think it's interesting. You're right, because you even pointed up last week as well. If anyone could do it, I mean, Microsoft, if they've got it in themselves, could sit down with Intel, ask for these features to be arranged, and then because they have control over the Surface and the operating system, they could probably get the most out of it. But let's face it, I mean, probably in this day and age, there's room for someone like Elon Musk or Amazon, Bezos, to start their own brand, an Amazon computer, and there's no reason they couldn't, do what Apple have done and probably usurp straight away all the chip makers. In fact, if I was an Intel, Celeron or Qualcomm, I'd probably be a little bit nervous, because if anyone else follows Apple's lead and makes any device that's any good, then really generic chips and generic chipsets starting to lose their value.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a thought to finish up on, a massive company coming in, buying all of those companies together and then starting it.
Oh, yeah, well, either that or another Kodak moment.
Exactly. All right, Steve, we might wrap it up there. So don't forget our website, scitechculture.com. You can get all of our links and content there. You can subscribe to our YouTube and Vimeo channels, our RSS feeds, and watch us on any and all of your devices. And we're greatly appreciative of your visits to our website. All right, so that's it for this episode. We'll catch you next time.